YouTube, Big Swole 58 here. Welcome back. You know, I buy a lot of early model Smith Wesson revolvers, and today I want to share a couple of tips with you about buying these guns to help ensure that you're getting a good quality gun. And I also want to show you what I look for during my inspection. Now, one of the tips I want to share with you is I never buy a gun from a seller that won't allow me an inspection period. If I'm not allowed to inspect the gun to my satisfaction, then as far as I'm concerned, that's a no-go. I won't buy it. The seller should be willing to let you inspect the gun to the point that you're satisfied with it. Now, tip number 2 I want to share is if I'm buying a gun from an online service, whenever possible, I'll always pay with a major credit card or another pay service like PayPal. Because if when I receive the gun, if there's anything wrong with it, or if the gun was misrepresented in any sort of way, the credit card company or PayPal will serve as an advocate for me to return the gun back to the seller and I get my money back. The last thing you want to do is to buy a gun in good faith and receive one that was misrepresented or one that doesn't meet your liking during your inspection, and then you're stuck with it because you paid with cash or a money order. Now I want to show you what I look for during my inspection. So the first thing I do is I just give the gun a good overall look. I'm just looking for signs of abnormal use, abnormal wear and tear, or physical damage that may be present on the gun. And I'll look the gun over completely on both sides. Now what I look for are any kind of unsightly or unusual deep scratches or gouges or rust on a blued gun, things that could be, expensive to repair if repairable at all. I look for any sort of physical damage to the front or the rear sights, any kind of abnormalities or deformities. I pay close attention to the hammer. If the gun has been dropped, the hammer may be disfigured. If it was dropped, the sights may be broken or damaged, especially on the front sight. It could actually be mushroomed. And I'll look for physical damage to the stocks or the grips if they're rubber. So I always look for those sort of things. But I just give the gun a really good look over to make sure everything looks like it should look and there's nothing unsightly or concerning about it. If I see something that I don't like and I think it's just too much to deal with, I don't need to inspect any further. I'm done. I won't buy the gun. Now, another thing I always look for is I'm always looking at the seams between the end plate and the frame. That's a good indication of whether or not someone has taken the side plates off or kind of, messed around inside the gun. Now, that's not a big deal as long as the person that's doing that is a qualified gunsmith or a good owner that knows exactly what they're doing. I always check the screws to make sure they're not boogered up too bad or not rounded out or have a lot of damage to them. If you see screws that have been really messed up, chances are the person who was removing the screws or monkeying around inside of the gun probably wasn't the one that need to been doing that. Now, you also want the gun to be clean. Now, a clean gun does not necessarily indicate a good gun, and a dirty gun doesn't necessarily indicate a bad gun. But the physical condition of a gun is usually going to be the best indicator of how the gun was managed by the last owner. If it's dirty on the outside, chances are it's also dirty on the inside. But likewise, if it's clean on the outside, chances are it's probably well maintained and clean on the inside. So those are two things, though, that I don't put a lot of importance on them. I always consider those two elements as well. And what I do from here is I do a function check of the gun. First thing I'll do is first I check to make sure that the gun is empty. Then I just pull the trigger. And I'll pull it on each empty cylinder. Now what I'm looking for here is a smooth trigger pull. It doesn't matter if it's tight. If the gun's not been shot much, then the trigger pull may be heavy. What I'm looking for is to make sure that it's smooth, that it isn't unnecessarily tight, and the cylinder rotation is smooth. And the hammer should drop heavily on all of the chambers. I'm looking for the double action feel on the gun at this point. If the double action feels good, I'll proceed to the single action pull, and I'll just pull the hammer back, check the rotation on each cylinder. What I'm looking for here is to make sure that the cylinder and the timing is correct, that it rotates and locks into place before the hammer pulls all the way back. And again, I'll do this on all of the chambers. Now if that's well, now is a good time, since you have the hammer pulled back, to check the firing pin. It should be free of damage and should have a nice little spring tension on it. Now is a good time too also to check for hammer push off. Just a nice little push on the hammer. It should not push off unless the trigger's pulled. If you by chance have a revolver where the hammer's pushing off without the trigger being pulled, that for me is a no-go, and should also be for you. A hammer that's pushing off without the trigger pulled in a single action mode, first off, is not fit to be carried where you can pull the hammer back. That needs to be repaired, or the old fix would be to cut the hammer spur off so you can only use the gun in a double action. But the proper repair for that could be expensive. It could be a case of replacing the hammer, the trigger, internal parts. For me, it's a no-go. I won't buy a gun with the hammer pushing off. So if that's all okay, I'll just continue with my inspection. I'll roll the cylinder out, and there's a good chance to check the cylinder thumb piece. It should be under a slight amount of spring tension, and it should return on its own. By pressed in, the cylinder should roll out easily. At this point, you want to check the cylinder for any sort of damage that you may not have seen from the outside. I'll always inspect the internal walls of each one of the chambers. I'm looking for, scratches, deep gouges, anything unsightly. And I'll also check the cylinder for any kind of cracks. You usually won't see it on a gun unless someone has used some extremely heavy loads. You may see some damage on the cylinder, but usually you won't. I'll check the cylinder face for any kind of scratches, and I'll check the extractor rod to make sure it's not bent. You can do that just by rotating the cylinder, and you shouldn't see any sort of up or down movement on the extractor shaft or the extractor rod. I'll check the function of the extractor just by pushing in and out. It should be good spring tension on it. It should return each time all the way back to its full arrested position. At this point, I'll check the forcing cone. It should be smooth and without crack or flaw. And I'll check the edges of the recoil plate to make sure if either one of those sides are not damaged or have any dings or unsightly marks on it. The cylinder stop bolt, again, is something you want to check. Just by pushing down on it, it should spring back nicely, and it shouldn't have any problems. Shouldn't be bent or broken or anything like that. Now, these guns could be anywhere from 30 to 70 years old. It's not uncommon to see a little bit of wear on it, but it shouldn't be anything unsightly or unusual. Now, another thing you want to check that a lot of people may overlook is the serial number. Now, there's two places where the serial number is going to appear on the frame. It's going to appear right here under the crane, and it'll appear on the butt of the gun. But you want to check those to make sure they haven't been tampered with. You do not want to buy a gun if there is any evidence that the serial number may have been tampered with or altered. Now I'm looking for the frame fit. That gap there should be extremely tight and uniform. If it's not, it's usually an indication that the crane may be bent and or the gun has been cowboyed. A lot of revolver owners like to open the cylinder, spin it, and slam it shut, and that is not a good thing for revolvers. It can either bend the yoke, and that's just not a good thing. So next I want to check for is cylinder lockup. You're going to have a little bit of movement on cylinder lockup, but what you want is for it to lock up on all of the chambers, and once it's locked, there should be very little to only slight cylinder movement. That is about what you would normally see on these older revolvers. You remember, these guns in most cases have been carried and or shot, so you're going to have a little bit of wear on them, but it shouldn't be anything excessive. I always check for front to rear cylinder movement, and I always check the gap between the face of the cylinder and the forcing cone, and that should be very minimal. Now the last thing that I like to check for is I always check the bore of the revolver. And what I'm looking for is a clean, smooth bore with sharp rifling. The lands and the grooves should be clean and sharp, and I don't expect to see any sort of fouling or buildup inside the bore. If I see anything that concerns me, I'll run a bore brush or a clean patch into the bore to see what comes out. If I see something like rust or material that shouldn't normally be there, then I'll either do a more thorough inspection, and if the seller has an issue with that, then I'll use this in my inspection and just not buy the revolver. Now another place that I always look doing these inspections is I'll always remove the stocks. A lot of owners don't remove their stocks on a regular basis, especially when they're cleaning their guns, and you'll get a lot of corrosion and pitting right under the top edge of these stocks and right along the rear tang where the stocks meet the frame tang, and you'll get a lot of rust and corrosion pitting there, especially on blued guns. Now, on a stainless gun, it's usually going to be something minor, and it'll clean right up with a metal polish or a good gun cleaner. But if it's a blued gun, it can be significant enough rust where you can't repair it, and you have to decide at that point whether or not you want to continue with the purchase of the gun. Now, if at this point I'm satisfied with the gun, I'll go ahead and finish the transfer process if I'm at the FFL, or I'll go ahead and finish the purchase if I'm at just working with a dealer or a personal seller. So I think if you use these two simple tips and these same inspection techniques, I believe you'll be a lot more comfortable with buying some of these older revolvers. This is Big Swole 58. Thanks for watching.